At 6:40 on a cold November morning, a faded green pickup crawled into Red Cedar, Missouri, carrying what looked like the remains of a dead fence. The bed was stacked above the cab with gray hedge posts, crooked, split, nail-scared pieces pulled from abandoned sheep lots, and collapsed cattle lanes. Behind the wheel was Mara Hensley, 59 years old, recently widowed, and apparently paying cash for wood other farmers were glad to burn. By the time she passed the grain elevator, 3 men had stopped talking just to watch her go by. One of them finally said, "She's hauling home kindling." He was wrong. But Mara would need an entire winter, one public failure, and a pasture full of frightened cattle before she could prove it. For 36 years, Mara and her husband, Dean, had run a small cow-calf operation on the Broken Hills south of town. Their land was beautiful from the highway and punishing up close. Thin soil on the ridges, wet clay in the bottoms, and fences that never stayed fixed for long. Dean handled the machinery, the breeding records, and every conversation with the bank. Mara handled almost everything else. Then, in late spring, Dean collapsed while repairing a water line below the north pond. By the time Mara reached him, the wrench was still in his hand. After the funeral, the farm did not pause with her. Calves still needed working. Thistles still climbed the south pasture. A note at the bank came due in September. 2 miles of perimeter fence leaned under the weight of rusted wire and years of deferred repair. Her older brother urged her to liquidate the herd before winter. Her daughter found a real estate agent who specialized in legacy properties. Mara listened to both of them. Then she folded the agent's card in half and put it under a coffee mug. The farm was not ready to be sold. Neither was she. But refusing to sell did not solve the problem. New posts, wire, diesel, and hay were draining cash faster than her calves could replace it. The pasture nearest the barn had been grazed nearly to dust because it was the only field with reliable fencing. The lower 80 still held grass, but moving cattle there meant repairing a maze of broken corners and sagging gates. Mara needed a way to divide pasture without rebuilding the whole farm. She also needed it cheap. The answer arrived at a regional grazing workshop in Springfield. Mara almost did not attend. She had driven 2 hours, sat in the last row, and kept her coat on, as if she might leave early. Then a retired soil and forage specialist named Leon Avery held up a cross-section cut from an old Osage orange post. The outside was gray and checked. The center looked almost polished. "People judge these posts by the weathered skin," Leon said. "But load lives deeper than appearance." That sentence stopped her. Leon explained that old hedge and black locust posts were often discarded because their outer fibers looked ruined, even when the dense heartwood remained hard enough to outlast new softwood. The trick was not to trust color. It was to test the core, read the grain, and reject anything with deep fungal pockets or longitudinal splitting. Mara filled 6 notebook pages. She wrote down the price of new treated corner posts. She drew Leon's triangle brace diagram twice. She circled one phrase: "Temporary fence fails at the corners first." After the room emptied, she asked him how much strength could remain in a post that had already spent 40 years in the ground. Leon smiled. Enough to surprise anyone who only looked at the surface. That week, Mara started driving. She bought her first load from an abandoned sheep farm outside Willow Gap, 73 posts for $55. She bought another from a family clearing an old orchard fence. A third farmer let her take an entire pile if she also hauled away the wire. At home, she built a sorting lane behind Dean's machine shed. Every post went across 2 steel stands. She drove an awl into the ends to find soft pockets. She struck the wood with a small hammer and learned to hear the difference between a dull, rotten thud and the sharp ring of dense heartwood. She cut away failed sections, pulled staples by the bucket, and marked each usable piece with chalk. H for hedge, L for locust, question mark for anything she did not trust. The work was slow enough to feel foolish. Some days, half a load ended in the burn pile. Other days, one ugly post would reveal a core so hard it threw sparks from the saw chain. By January, Mara had 340 usable lengths stacked under roofing tin. She still did not have a product. What she had was a problem she understood. Permanent fencing was expensive. Lightweight polywire was cheap and fast, but it pulled loose at gates, corners, and changes in terrain. Step-in posts worked along straight runs. They failed where tension gathered, so Mara designed a portable brace kit. 2 reclaimed hardwood uprights joined by a short diagonal, pinned at the base with an insulated wheel at the top to carry electric polywire. The brace could stand at a corner without a buried post. A farmer could move it by hand and reset a paddock without digging holes. On paper, it looked simple. In the field, it was a disaster. Her first brace was too tall and top-heavy. A cow rubbed against it, and the whole corner folded into the mud. The second version held until the wire tightened. Then the diagonal split along an old check she had failed to notice. The third version survived the cattle and failed in the wind. During a February storm, 6 braces twisted sideways, dragging hot wire across a lane and spooking 27 cows toward the creek. Mara ran through sleet with a plastic fence handle in one hand and a bucket of feed in the other, trying to turn the herd before they reached a washed-out crossing. She got them stopped, barely. When the last cow settled behind the barn, Mara stood alone in the dark with ice in her hair and blood running from a cut across her palm. For the first time since Dean died, selling the farm sounded reasonable. Not shameful. Reasonable. That frightened her more than the storm. The next morning, 2 neighbors drove by slowly enough to see the broken braces piled beside the lane. By noon, the story had reached the diner. The widow had built a fence out of junk. The junk had won. Mara did not go into town. She called Leon Avery. He arrived 3 days later with a thermos, a folding ruler, and no sympathy in his voice. He studied the failed brace, then drew a triangle in the mud with the heel of his boot. "You keep asking the wood to act like steel," he said. "It won't. But steel can't do what this wood does, either." He showed her where the force had traveled. The diagonal was carrying tension in the wrong direction. The top pin locked the frame so tightly that every gust multiplied stress at the weakest check. Her brace did not need to be stiffer. It needed a controlled place to move. That became Mara's breakthrough. She shortened the uprights, reversed the brace angle, and replaced the rigid top bolt with a floating hardwood pin. She cut shallow relief slots that allowed a fraction of flex without loosening the frame. She added a broad foot made from discarded conveyor belting, so the brace would not sink into wet clay. Most important, she stopped to make every piece of old wood identical. She built around what each piece could still do. The next prototype held through rain. The next held against a yearling bull. The next survived a full week at the sharp corner below the pond, where the grade pulled hardest. Mara timed herself resetting a paddock. 11 minutes. She did it again. 10 minutes. 42 seconds. By April, she could move a quarter-mile of polywire and 4 corner braces before the cattle finished bawling at the gate. The grass changed first. The trampled field near the barn began to rest. Clover returned along the lower slope. The creek pasture, grazed for 2 days and left alone for 3 weeks, came back so thick that Mara delayed turning cattle into it. Then the cattle changed. They spread out. They fouled less ground around the water. Their body condition held deeper into summer. The farm was not healed, but it had stopped losing ground. A neighbor named Calvin Doss noticed. He had spent years driving past Mara's place without slowing. Now he stopped twice in 1 week. The third time, he pulled into the lane and asked why her south pasture looked better than his. Mara showed him the brace. Calvin turned it over in his hands, pressed his thumb against the black gold heartwood, and asked what it cost. Mara had not decided, so he decided for her. "I'll give you $200 for 6, and I'll bring my own wire." She built his set in 4 evenings. 3 weeks later, Calvin ordered 8 more. His brother ordered 10. A goat producer outside Ash Hollow asked for a smaller version that could hold net fencing. Mara changed the foot, lowered the wheel, and sold her first custom set. By midsummer, the sorting lane behind the machine shed had become a small workshop. A used drill press stood where Dean once stored mineral tubs. Patterns hung from nails on the wall. Each finished brace carried a burned-in mark, MH, inside a small triangle. The numbers mattered now. A brace made from new treated lumber would have cost her almost 3 times as much in materials. Reclaimed hardwood took longer to inspect, but once the cutting jig was built, a set of 4 could be finished in an afternoon. Farmers using the system were moving cattle more often, resting grass longer, and buying less emergency hay. Calvin tracked his expenses carefully. By the end of the first grazing season, he estimated his purchased feed was down 18%. That number traveled faster than any advertisement. Orders came from 3 counties, then 5. A county grazing group invited Mara to demonstrate the brace at a field day. She stood before 60 farmers beside the same kind of battered posts they had spent years throwing away. She did not tell them the wood was indestructible. She showed them how to reject the bad pieces. She showed them how to sound the core with a hammer. She showed them the floating pin, the relief slot, the broad foot, and the triangle that carried the load. "Old doesn't mean sound," she said. "You still have to know what you're looking at." Then she lifted one of the ugliest posts in the pile. But ugly doesn't mean finished. In October, a developer from Kansas City arrived in a white SUV with clean boots and an offer large enough to clear Mara's debt, buy a house in town, and leave money for her grandchildren. He wanted the ridgeline for vacation cabins. He spoke gently, as if he were rescuing her from work. Mara let him finish. Then she walked him behind the machine shed. Under the roofing tin sat rows of reclaimed hedge and locust, sorted by length. On one side were 27 completed orders. On the other were the patterns for a new walk-through gate and a brace designed for steep ground. Beyond the shed, cattle moved quietly into fresh grass while the grazed paddock rested behind them. The developer looked at the gray wood, the scarred pasture, and the woman who had nearly lost both. He saw property. Mara saw a system that was finally beginning to carry its own weight. "No," she said. That was all. By the second winter, Mara's workshop had paid the overdue banknote and covered most of her hay bill. She had sold brace kits to cattlemen, goat farms, 2 school agriculture programs, and a conservation crew restoring creek banks. More important, her own farm entered winter with grass standing in the lower fields for the first time in 6 years. The old posts did not save her by themselves. Knowledge did. Failure did. The willingness to look past a damaged surface and find the parts still capable of carrying load did. On the wall above her workbench, Mara hung the first brace that collapsed in the mud. She left the split diagonal exactly as it was. Next to it, she mounted a thin slice cut from one of the oldest hedge posts she had reclaimed. The outside was gray. The center was dark, dense, and nearly untouched. Most people who visited the shop noticed the broken brace first. Mara always noticed the heartwood. The gray was only on the outside.